We all know what a sandwich is. A filling in between two slices of bread. This is a sandwich. This is a sandwich. And according to some, these are also sandwiches. We also know that the sandwich is called a sandwich because it was invented by John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, while gambling. Except that might not really be true. Or at least it's not the full story. So, we are going to have a look at the sandwich's humble beginnings, the role the Earl actually played, and how it eventually came to be defined by... This can't be right. British Rail? Let's start with the famous story that you've probably heard before. John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, was a notorious gambler. He didn't just gamble like normal people did, he was a hardcore gamer. Apparently, the Earl was so hooked on gambling that he did not want to take a break, even when almost fainting from hunger. So he ordered his valet to take 2 pieces of bread and place some roast beef between them, allowing the Earl to have a one-handed meal while carrying on with his games. Hence, on that fateful day in 1762, the sandwich was born. And many card games were ruined because Montagu kept getting the cards greasy, or so the story goes. Well, we all know where this is going. Did the 4th Earl of Sandwich actually invent the sandwich? Well, sorta, not really, kind of in a way. No, but. We'll explain the no first, but then we'll get to the but. Straight out of the gate, we can safely say that John Montagu did not invent the sandwich. As in, he did not come up with the concept of wedging a protein or something sweet between 2 slices of bread. You don't need to do intense historical research for this. We made an entire series on how bread has been with us since pretty much the dawn of humanity. So it's not exactly a wild assumption to say that, let's say the last 10,000 years, whether they were cavemen, Romans, or medieval people, all of whom had bread as their main food source, somebody did this. It just makes no sense that this wasn't done until the middle of the 18th century AD. You don't really need sources for this, but if you want, they're out there, don't worry. So what were these called if not sandwiches? In English, they were just called bread and meat, or bread and cheese. Yeah, we know, not exactly exciting. But you can see it in old plays like The Old Wives' Tale by George Peele, which contains the line, "I took a piece of bread and cheese and came my way." For something more mainstream, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, by none other than William Shakespeare, Nym has the line, "I love not the humour of bread and cheese." It's pretty safe to say that John Montagu did not invent the food that we know as the sandwich today. So, what really happened for generations of people to call meat and bread, or cheese and bread, a sandwich? Well, the best known story linking the food and the man together comes from France. In 1765, the Earl of Sandwich was Northern Secretary, in between 2 of his stints as Lord of the Admiralty. At the same time, a young Frenchman and grand tourist called Pierre Jean Grosley spent a year in London. 5 years later, Pierre Jean published a book on his experiences, simply titled Londres. It's a mixture of profound findings and jabs at cultural differences. Very normal for grand tourists at the time. But there is one passage in this book that goes as follows. Les Anglois profonds, violents, outredent tous leurs passions, portant celle du jeu à l'extrême. On nomme plusieurs lords très riches qui s'y ont absolument ruinés. D'autres prenant sur les affaires, sur les repos, sur leur santé, le temps qu'ils lui donnant. Un ministre d'État passer 24 heures dans un jeu public, tous jeux occupés au point que pendant ces 24 heures, il ne vécut que des quelques tranches de bœuf grillé, qu'il se s'assoit servir entre 2 rôtis de pain, qu'il mangeant sans quitter le jeu. Ce ne sont mais des prix faveurs pendant mon séjour à Londres. On le baptisa du nom de ministre, qu'il avait imaginé, pour économiser le temps. Note that Grosley doesn't even mention Sandwich. So, was the Earl of Sandwich so infamous that everybody read this passage and went, "Ha! That's clearly Sandwich"? Well, let's have a look at what we know. John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, was your typical 18th century noble. He went on a grand tour when young, visiting the normal European destinations, but also Turkey and Egypt. After returning from his grand tour, he took his seat in Parliament as a lord. A few years later, he enters government and also the Admiralty, later becoming a colonel, helping prepare for a potential invasion by France. His career peaked when he made it to First Lord of the Admiralty, a post he held on 3 different occasions. Here he was the head of the largest navy in the world. Britannia rules the waves? Yes, by means of a sandwich. Sandwich has, over the years, garnered a posthumous reputation as a rakish libertine who was all about gambling and womanizing. But that does seem to be a little bit unfair to Montagu. True, he had his fair share of mistresses and paramours, but that was pretty normal for high nobility in those days. Was he a libertine? Well, he was reportedly a member of the Hellfire Club, a club that, some say, conducted satanic rituals and took their motto, "Fais que tu voudras," very literally. Others say that the Hellfire Club was just another gentleman's club, but with slightly naughtier art on the walls. Again, all elements that add to the myth. He did also gamble, but not to the debauched level usually attributed to him. Gambling was a social tool at the time, and a lot of people, especially the very rich, loved themselves a little punt. At one point, a cricket match Sandwich participated in had over £20,000 riding on it. That's a lot, if you realise that £1 was already above the average month's wages at the time. Also, these were just the people who were at the match. For as far as we can tell, when he was active in politics, Sandwich was a very level-headed man. Contemporary sources about his time in charge of the Royal Navy describe him as very normal and average, even a bit reserved. Looking a bit more critically at Grosley's text, the Frenchman seems to imply here that the English upper and political classes were so hung up on gambling that they stopped eating proper food. The 24-hour gambling binge he mentions possibly serves to show how they lost their ways. We don't think you need reminding that France and Britain weren't on the best terms during the 18th century, so a bit of banter was to be expected. Now, you might also notice that Grosley doesn't mention Sandwich, but just a Minister of State. So is that it? A bit of smear by a Frenchman who might still be sour about just losing the 7 Years' War, just stuck to Sandwich. Could we have been eating Bedfords or Clarences for lunch? Well, no. An essay by Matthew Gibbon, covering his club, the Cocoa Tree, of which he is clearly very proud, from 1762 reads: "The respectable body of which I have the honour of being a member affords every evening a sight truly English. 20 or 30, perhaps, of the first men of the kingdom, in point of fashion and fortune, supping at little tables covered with a napkin in the middle of a coffee room, upon a bit of cold meat or a sandwich, and drinking a glass of punch." So it was named after him. But why are we throwing so much shade here on the French source? The line "it was named after the minister" was clearly referring to Sandwich. Well, it probably was at best, a bit embellished. Even though Sandwich was known for a little flutter in the gentleman's club while out of work, when Grosley was in London, Sandwich was working as Northern's secretary. And by all accounts, he did so quite diligently. He did spend some time out of work from mid-1762 onwards, so maybe Grosley was nicking somebody else's story he heard after leaving London? We don't really know. But that 24-hour gaming binge doesn't really fit with the Sandwich we see in other contemporary sources. N.A.M. Rodgers, an authority on the Earl, theorizes that Montagu devised a type of meat and bread with roast beef which he could easily eat at his desk so he could continue to work. At best, that would make Sandwich the inventor of the rushed or skipped lunch break rather than the sandwich itself. Gee, thanks John. So we've established that Sandwich didn't invent the sandwich and that the gambling story was probably not the origin of the name, since it predates the rumour. So why do we call this a sandwich? Well, sorry to disappoint, we don't really know for sure. But there are some theories. Brits love naming everyday items after nobility, even if they didn't invent the item itself. Just think about that next time you put on your Wellingtons and a cardigan. Often a tenuous link or slight improvement will be all it takes for them to get the naming right. So, following this logic, it's possible that Sandwich just gave his name to a type of bread and meat rather than all of them. In other words, he could have invented, or at least popularized, the roast beef sandwich. The same sources that tell us that Sandwich was quite a modest man also tells us that, like many Englishmen of the era, he loved roast beef. Yes, we know, we're going on about roast beef again. We have a fondness for 17th and 18th century Britain, and when looking at that part of culinary history, roast beef just tends to creep up on you. Well, let's go ahead and make the roast beef sandwich for the Earl of Sandwich. First, take 2 slices of bread. Don't take factory bread, that process wasn't around yet. Toast the slices. In the 18th century, the slice would be put in a handheld grill and held to the hearth or a flame. Take a slice of your roast. As we've explained on this channel before, a roast would be made on Sunday, and then slices would be eaten from it for the rest of the week. So your roast would probably be cold and made a few days ago. Place between the 2 slices of bread and season with some English mustard. This stuff has been around since 1720, albeit a different brand, so we can use it. Now, enjoy Sandwich's sandwich while working hard. Or playing, depending which version you choose to believe. We can't say that Sandwich invented the roast beef sandwich. It's simply too simple a food to rule out somebody else having done it before. But he might just have popularized it. In older sources, bread and meat seems to have had a bit of a dour reputation of, at best, a quick snack to be eaten on the go. This would also explain why Grosley thought the story/rumour was worth publishing. A British minister spending his time gambling and eating sad food is like all the clichés the French had on the Brits rolled into one. It even had roast beef, the French slur for the English. It's essentially like saying, well, that minister was up all night playing Fortnite while eating crisps and drinking Mountain Dew. I don't know where you live, but I think, despite all progress, that even today, this wouldn't go down well in the House of Lords. However, the sandwich seemed to have had a much better reputation in England at the time. When we look back at Matthew Gibbon's essay about the cocoa tree, we see that the people who ate sandwiches were actually the upper echelon of society. So it is possible that Sandwich, inspired by the stuffed pita breads he saw while travelling in Egypt, had his cook make a roast beef sandwich which he could eat while doing other things. This in turn may have given bread and meat the required respectability to be adopted by the upper classes in an era of polite society and utilitarianism. Again, this is possible, but we can't prove it. If you do know something that contradicts this, let us know and we'll pin the comment. The only thing we know for sure is that Sandwich didn't invent the sandwich, and that the wild gambler story most likely wasn't true because they were already called sandwiches when the Earl of Sandwich was known as a hard worker rather than a hard gambler. One thing that we found particularly interesting was that, unlike Cardigan and Wellington, the word sandwich did bleed out in other languages. For instance, this is une tartine, but this is un sandwich. Not all languages started calling that a sandwich though. These days, different European languages use the word sandwich in different ways. We've mentioned French, but for example in Flanders, sandwich often refers to a brioche bun, while a sandwich is called een boterham. In German there are regional varieties, ranging from Butterbrot and Brot mit Käse, Fleisch, whatever, to, well, sandwich, which seems reserved for sandwiches made with toasted bread. Even within the English-speaking world, there are differences. In Britain, a sandwich is this: 2 slices of bread, something in the middle, done. Whereas, apparently, in the United States, loads of things can be a sandwich. Even a hot dog. That is weird. Let us know what sandwich means in your language, or what you call a modern incarnation of meat and bread. Down below. Also, while you are down there leaving us your wisdom, you will, if we did our homework, find a button that leaves a thanks or join the channel. If you become a channel member, you will have access to things like videos with production comments. Want to know which video we made while he was dying of COVID? Well, you can find out on the 2nd tier level. If you're not willing or able to make a financial contribution, all good, we completely understand. But then all we'd ask is for you to just hit that subscribe or like button. Those are completely free and will still help us out. Thank you very much. One thing we did notice, and this is anecdotal, is that in most languages, sandwich, or a local variation of the word, seems to be reserved for the triangular cut pre-made sandwiches. So how did these come about? Even though sandwiches were adopted by the higher classes, when the Industrial Revolution came round, sandwiches were also popular among the working classes as a quick mobile meal. Unlike before, where people worked in or near their own home, can you imagine that? Now, people had to commute into the mills and factories. And in Victorian times, employers did not provide nice cafeterias. So the sandwich became a meal that workers could prepare at home, take to work, and then eat quickly when they had a moment. To this day, sandwiches are still the main packed lunch food item in most of the Western world as far as we're aware. It wasn't long before companies started selling sandwiches, and since the sandwich was the food of the commuting worker, the providers of said commutes, mainly the railways, began offering them in refreshment rooms inside stations. As you might expect, their reputation wasn't exactly stellar. In 1866, Charles Dickens wrote a short story called Mainline, The Boy at Mugby. It tells the story of a boy who worked in the refreshment room at the fictional station. Sandwiches sold in said refreshment rooms were described in a very unflattering way. Pitch the stale pastry into the plates and chuck the sawdust sandwiches under the glass covers. And the merry, wide-awake American gent had tried the sawdust and spit it out. Oh dear. At this point, the makers and providers of these sandwiches were still the many different railway companies. Later, sandwiches also started being sold on moving trains rather than just in the stations. Probably because, judging by the descriptions we've read, they needed a captive audience. However, after World War II, the railways here in Britain were nationalised, like they soon will be again. And so the sandwiches were now centrally controlled by one state-owned company. Now, we are firm believers here that certain services are best run publicly, trains being one of them. So, did the sandwich benefit from being run by the Transport Secretary?
I want to complain about this sandwich. It tastes like muck.
Well, of course, it's a muck sandwich.
Well, not really. In typical British fashion, the British Rail Sandwich as a byword for, frankly, sad food became a running gag. There are tons of colourful descriptions out there. For instance, in 2005, Keith Lovegrove wrote of the British Rail Sandwich as, "It was a sandwich of contradictions. It could be cold and soggy, or stale and hard, and the corners of the isosceles triangle-shaped bread would often curl up like the pages of a well-thumbed paperback." It's pretty, but not very appetizing. If you were around to enjoy the occasional British Rail Sandwich, let us know your impressions down below. Again, we're very interested. In 1971, director of rail catering Bill Curry, fitting name, issued guidance to all the separate British rail kitchens to standardize and improve the British Rail Sandwich and to make it best on track. Okay, let's do this. Let's make a British Rail cheese and tomato sandwich, as if it were the 1970s. Since this is government mandated food after the invention of the Chorleywood process, we will be using the most factory bread we can get our hands on. We're quite confident about this as the recipe appears to require a perfectly square sheet of bread. Oh god, this is from before metrification. Firstly, the butter should be creamed to make it spreadable. Oh, this might actually be good. We were expecting a cheap lengthening of the butter or a replacement spread, but creamed butter sounds nice. 1/6 of an ounce per slice of bread. Oh. British Rail sandwiches did have a reputation for being under-buttered. Someone who worked for British Rail hotels and catering noted, "It is true that we were instructed in the art of spreading the butter on the roll and then scraping it off again, so that only the thinnest residue would remain." Sounds nice. Make sure it's coated from edge to edge. Okay, fair enough. If it's going to be thin, it might as well be even. Step 3. Place approximately 2/3 of the filling to cover the whole of the surface of the bread. That's odd. Why? Maybe step 4 will explain why. Step 4. Place the remaining third of the filling diagonally across the bread where the cut is to be made. Hang on. Step 5 reads, ensure that a good proportion of the laid down quantity is also laid diagonally across the bread where the sandwich is to be cut. This will enable a customer to identify easily the sandwich filling in addition to improving the appearance. The bloody cheek! Now wrap tightly in cling film and display. And then, in our case, eat it yourself. And it's a sandwich. When it's fresh, it's fine. But if this were left under glass for a long time, we get where the bad reviews came from. The debatable quality of the British Rail sandwich might have even helped the demise of British Rail itself. When the re-privatisation of the railways was being debated, the Conservatives loved equating British Rail with the sandwich to show how it all just didn't work. British Rail made desperate attempts to reinvent the sandwich, like getting Prue Leith, yeah, that one, to come up with ideas. But in the mind of the public, that didn't work. 1993 would be the last year you could get a British Rail sandwich. And they only sold a measly 8 million. This country and culinary masochism. Gotta love it. Anyway, does the renationalisation of the railways mean that the sandwich is on its way back? Well, no. In 2021, when the Conservatives did a sort of mini nationalisation, they actually brought up the sandwiches again. But that was the previous government. So far, the current one has been quite silent on the issue. Come on, Keir, do it. Bring them back. So, if British Rail sandwiches were originally wrapped in paper or cling film, how do we get to these things? Even in the final years of the British Rail sandwich, they also came in these boxes. Who came up with these? In 1979, somebody at Marks & Spencer had thought, people seem to hate these British Rail sandwiches, but they still buy millions. What if we made them good? And so, in 1980, M&S ran a sandwich pilot in a few shops. Storerooms were converted into makeshift kitchens and sandwiches were made on site, sealed in plastic and refrigerated. The first official M&S sandwich was salmon and tomato at 43p, although other varieties like egg and cress were also around quite quickly. The stage was set and no one in those first few shops thought that the idea would actually take off. After all, who in their right mind would spend money on something you can make yourself by just slapping some leftovers together? Well, it turns out they underestimated the great British love for convenient lunch. The sandwiches flew off the shelves so quickly that shops had to use anything they're lying around to make more. Within a year, Marks & Spencer's needed external suppliers to satisfy demand. 10 years later, the sandwich industry was worth £1 billion. Shortly after M&S's success, other shops started copying the pre-packaged sandwiches. But not all made them in store. In 1985, Boots opened a national sandwich centre to supply their shops, and they introduced the meal deal. If you've ever held an office job in Britain, you know what a meal deal is. There's a ton of combos, but the standard is a drink, a sandwich and a pack of crisps. If you leave one of the three out, you tend to end up paying more. Found out the hard way. So to end, let's make a salmon and tomato sandwich. This was an M&S sandwich, so you can have plain or seeded bread, but it should still be industrially made. When in doubt, stick with white. Take a nice juicy tomato and cut it into thin slices. Get yourself a nice slice of smoked salmon, ideally from M&S. Butter your slices of bread, ideally with the butter we creamed earlier. Put 2 slices of tomato on the bread and 1 slice of salmon over top, making sure that the bulk of the toppings are in the middle. We're still running a business here. Cut diagonally and eat with crisps while gaming or working. It would make John Montagu proud. We hope you enjoyed this history of the sarnie. It's been a while since we made a video because we're working on a system where we can upload more frequently, but this requires us to have some few videos saved up, so we should be back very soon. Thank you very much for watching.